Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to AJ102 Introduction to Criminal Justice. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So, this week's chapter is going to be chapter 13, where we're going to take a look at corrections, a little bit of history, some of the different types of institutions, and also some of the prison populations. So a lot to cover. Let's go ahead and just jump right into our lecture for this week. So what do we hope to learn or take away? First, to be able to identify the various components of the correctional institution system, be able to discuss or articulate how the first penal institutions developed, where did they come from, explain how William Penn and the Quakers revolutionized corrections in Pennsylvania, compare the early New York and Pennsylvania prison system models, discuss the development of penal reform, explain the purposes of jails, and understand the characteristics that make up jail populations. And is there a difference between a jail and a prison? And the answer is yes, and we'll get to that. Define the new generation jail. That sounds interesting, right? Classify the different types of federal and state institutions, and then discuss some of the prison population trends. So a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and just kind of jump right in. So some corrections officials maintain that jails and prisons should be used to help treat and rehabilitate convicted offenders in what they call therapeutic communities. And I mean, I'm not trying to be soft, but a lot of people believe in the rehabilitation efforts, and I think that should be part of it. Now, in contrast, others believe secure facilities should be designed to deter those criminals, those that might commit crime, etc., and keep those convicted individuals, those who have been convicted of crimes, separate and apart from society. Now, under this model, prison success is measured by such factors of physical security, length of incapacitation, a lower crime rate, and the fear of criminal sanctions. Now, on the surface, the get tough approach, if you will, appears to be effective after all, right? The crime rate has declined in the United States as the number of people under lock and key or who have been incarcerated has risen. But is that really important? Well, the United States has only 5% of the world's population, but nearly 1/4 of the world's prisoners. So that's kind of interesting, right? And yet there still is kind of uncertainty over whether the use of secure confinement is in fact responsible for the crime rate drop in America. And, I mean, if you logically speaking, it would be easy for everyone to think, hey, if there's all these criminals and we lock them up and they can't be criminals anymore, shouldn't the crime rate go down? So that's kind of what some people are thinking, and others don't really adhere to that. Now, police effectiveness and improving social conditions may be important factors in lowering crime rates than that current prison boom, right? And even if imprisonment has led to crime reductions, America's prisons and jails can really only handle so many people, right? We can only accommodate so many people as as California has really experienced and made it abundantly clear with early prisoner release and the court orders mandating that California prisons lower their population because they are so overcrowded, right? So we've kind of run into that, and we know what that's all about in California. And the question, can you just keep building prisons, is another question that kind of comes up. Now, there really is no question that the correctional system has become pretty complex, and now contains a variety of institutions designed to house and correct different types of offenders, right? And that kind of makes sense. Felons are housed in high security prisons, while those that are, maybe incarcerated for misdemeanors are housed in a county jail, okay, which are sometimes referred to as even reformatories or houses of corrections, etc., but typically county jails. And then a little bit more, juvenile offenders have their own institutions called, it could be schools, camps, ranches, or homes, or detention facilities, depending upon the state that you're in, right? There are also prison farms for adult offenders, and there are community correction centers, such as halfway houses for inmates who are about to return to society. So really, kind of what we're going to explore a little bit more in this section is the correctional system, beginning with a little bit of history and the nature of correctional institutions. And then when we get to chapter 14, we'll really look at institutional life, etc. But we know, again, jail is short-term, prison is long-term, and that's another way to kind of look at it. So what is a jail then, before we get into the history? So a jail is a correctional facility designed to hold pretrial detainees and those arrested or serving time for misdemeanors, serving their criminal sentence, and is typically sentenced to less than a year. It says here a year or less of incarceration. That is typically true, but it could be less than a year. So let's just go with year or less. Now, just a quick note, while the textbook also tells us misdemeanors, there are some felony suspects in the county jail, especially with prisoner realignment and early release and all that other stuff. A lot of individuals that were housed in prisons are being moved to the county jail. So just know that there are felony suspects in county jails now. All right, and a prison, on the flip side, is a correctional facility designed to hold convicted felons while they serve out their criminal sentence, and typically those that are sentenced to over 1 year. Although, again, because of overcrowding, some of these individuals could be pushed down to the county jail. But those are at least some key definitions for you to understand the difference between a jail and a prison. All right, so the original legal punishments were typically things like banishment, or slavery, restitution, corporal punishment, and even execution. The concept of incarcerating convicted offenders for long periods of time as a punishment for their misdeeds did not really become the norm in corrections until about the 19th century. And then you can see some old photos of some of the old correctional facilities, etc. And a couple of other kind of history things to show you before we move on. These were some of the early punishments as well, whether it was the rack, the stocks, the stretching of the rack, or some other more serious type penalties, etc. And these are how things have evolved to where we're at today, where you have the gas chamber and you have the electric chair. You might have what they call the needle, so it'll be the injection, and in one particular state, firing squad. So there are different methods of correctional punishment, etc. All right, so although the use of incarceration as a routine punishment began much later, some early European institutions were created specifically to detain and control criminal offenders. Now, the first penal institutions were basically horrible, foul places, devoid of proper care, food, medical treatment. The conditions were basically deplorable, meaning bad, because jailers ran them for personal gain. And, the fewer the services, right, the more profit that could actually be made in those particular institutions. And early jails were kind of catch-all institutions that held not only criminal offenders, let's say, waiting trial, but also homeless individuals, those that owed money, mentally ill, and others. All right. So it was kind of like they held everybody. It wasn't just, big time felons in one area and misdemeanors in the other. Okay. So everybody was in the same place. Now, the jailer, usually a sheriff is what they called it back then, which would be the term sheriff, okay, for today, was an official appointed by the king or the noble landholder as the chief law enforcement official of a county, and that person basically ran the jail under what they call a free system, whereby inmates were required to pay their own food, and for services. So they actually had to pay, and those who could not pay were basically fed scraps of food until they pretty much starved to death. So not only were you placed in custody in a jail, if you will, but you had to pay for some of the services in order to get proper food, etc. Now, from 1776 to about 1785, a growing inmate population that could no longer be transported to North America, because they used to banish people and take them away somewhere else. When this was not an option anymore, basically forced the English to house prisoners on what they called hulks. And these hulks were basically abandoned ships anchored in harbors. And these hulks became very infamous for their really bad conditions and brutal punishment. But they really weren't abandoned until about 1858. So they were around for quite some time. So again, these hulks were basically kind of ships that were out of commission, if you will, and they were used to house prisoners in 18th century England. And you can look at, kind of an old one here, and you can look at a newer ship over here. So, and you actually noticed in COVID with the issues in some of the cities that had the larger ports, they actually brought in medical ships, if you recall, to house, COVID patients. So this really was an idea that seemed okay at the time. All right, so the origin of corrections in the United States is usually traced to the 18th century developments in Pennsylvania under the leadership of an individual by the name of William Penn. And at the end of the 17th century, Penn basically revised Pennsylvania's criminal code to forbid things like torture, mutilation, and physical punishment. And Penn basically ordered that a new type of institution be built to replace the widely used public forms of punishment. Things that I talked about earlier, like the stocks or the pillars or the gallows, or branding irons, etc. And each county was instructed to build a house of correction basically similar to today's jails. And Penn's reforms remained in effect until his death in about 1718, when the criminal penal code was changed back to basically open public punishment and harsh brutality. So, under pressure from the Quakers at that time, the Pennsylvania legislature in 1790 called for basically an overhaul or a renovation of the prison system. And, the eventual kind of result, what happened out of this, was the creation of a separate wing of Philadelphia's Walnut Street Jail to house convicted felons, except for those that were sentenced to death. So what we have, again, we're starting to see some advances and some separation, right? So after the demand for reform, and at that time, the Quakers' influence on the legislature resulting, in limited use of the death penalty, etc., really kind of started to turn the tide. So under pressure from the Quakers, this Pennsylvania legislature in 1790, again, they started to kind of do some renovation, right? And the result here was the creation of a separate wing of Philadelphia's Walnut Street Jail to house those convicted felons, if you will, okay, except those that were sentenced to death. Now, prisoners were, it was kind of the birthplace, if you will, of modern prison systems, because you started to see separate areas, right? Prisoners were placed in solitary cells where they remained in isolation and did not have the right to work at that particular time. And quarters that contained, the solitary or separate cells were called penitentiary houses, as was already the custom in England. And similar institutions were then basically built in New York and New Jersey. So by definition, a penitentiary house is a correctional institution for those convicted of major crimes. Okay, so we're starting to see the first look at a penitentiary, a place for penance, right? That's kind of where penitentiary comes from. So in about 1818, Pennsylvania took the radical step of establishing a prison that placed each inmate in a single cell for the duration of their sentence. And along with that, classifications were abolished, basically, because each cell was intended kind of as a miniature prison that would prevent inmates from associating with one another. So, kind of interesting thing that kind of came around. And it was based on this total isolation and individual penitence, right? You're serving your penitence. You're paying the price for what you did. And this basically, this thought process, this theory, if you will, reflected the influence of religion and religious philosophy on corrections. So, you're going to be by yourself. You're going to serve your time by yourself. You're not going to have any fun. You're not going to hang around with anybody. And you're going to pay penance. You're going to serve your time. So you can kind of see a little bit of the religious influence that comes into corrections. Now, a little bit later, all right, in about 1816, New York built a new prison at Auburn, hoping to alleviate some of the issues relating to overcrowding, okay, because there were a lot of issues of overcrowding. Now, the Auburn prison design, this is kind of called the Auburn system, but the Auburn prison design became known as the tier system because cells were built vertically on 5 floors of the structure. It was also referred to as the congregate system because most prisoners ate and worked in groups. So you can look at the picture and you can see the different floors. You would have the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth floors. And you could house more people, right, if you went up. So they were still, they could still be single cells or they could hold 2 people, however it was at that particular time. A lot of times back then it was single cells again, but to save space, etc., they would go up. And this is kind of the tier system. But what changed is that they could actually, eat and work in groups and then go back to their individual cells, if you will. And hopefully that kind of makes sense. Now, the philosophy, of this particular Auburn system was crime prevention through fear and self-confinement. The worst felons were to be cut off from all contact with other prisoners. And although they were treated and fed relatively well, they had no hope of a pardon to relieve their solitude or isolation. Hard work and silence became the foundation of this Auburn system, wherever it was adopted. And silence was the key to prison discipline. It prohibited basically the formulation of escape plans, right? It prevented plots and riots, and it allowed prisoners to basically think about or contemplate what they have done. Okay, so you can see, I mean, effective back in those particular days. So just by quick review, remember the tier system, a type of prison where cells are located on corridors on multiple levels. You know, the congregate system, which was a prison system that originated in New York, in which inmates worked and ate together during the day, but then they were back in solitary cells at night. And the Auburn system, which was kind of what we just got done talking about, that was back in 1816, a prison system developed in New York during the 19th century based on that congregate or group work during the day and separation at night. Okay? And there are some other systems to kind of talk about a little bit before we start to move into some reform efforts. So basically, prison industry developed and became the predominant theme around which institutions were organized. And some prisons used what they called the contract system, in which officials sold the labor of inmates to private businesses. Okay? And sometimes the contractor supervised the inmates inside of the prison itself. Now, under the convict lease system, the state basically leased its prisoners to a business for a fixed annual fee and gave up supervision and control. And finally, some institutions had prisoners produce goods for the prison's own use. Now, beginning in the 1870s, opposition by trade unions sparked some restrictions on interstate commerce in prison goods. And after the Civil War, a number of states abandoned the contract system and introduced what they called the public account system, under which employment was directed by the state and the products of the prisoner's labor were sold for the benefit of the state. And some correctional jurisdictions compensated prisoners for their labor, but deducted funds for things like room, board, clothing, and the costs of trial. And therefore, the remaining funds were sent to the inmates' families and dependents. And for inmates who had no family or dependents, their earnings accumulated and were paid to them upon their release. So some different systems that we're kind of looking at, right? So all are kind of interesting. And on page 508 in your textbook, you can see the differences between, let's say, the Auburn system and the Pennsylvania system. And they have a little chart there that kind of shows the difference between the two. Remember, when you talk about the Pennsylvania system, that's the prison system developed in Pennsylvania, right? Kind of makes sense. During the 19th century, based on the total isolation and individual penitence, right? Versus the Auburn system, which was one where they could congregate together during the day, but then they're going to be solitary at night. Okay, so again, a lot to cover. So what about some reform efforts? So the National Congress of Penitentiary and Reformatory Discipline, held in Cincinnati in 1870, brought in a new age of reform, basically. Okay? And one of the most famous people to attend that particular congressional setting was Zebulon Brockway, warden of the Elmira Reformatory in New York, who advocated individualized treatment and the indeterminate sentence and parole. So these are some things that started to kind of change a little bit. So we're seeing some different things. We're seeing, individualized treatment for inmates. We're seeing indeterminate sentencing, and we're also seeing the possibility of people getting out, right, which would be parole. So what about in the 20th century? So the early 20th century was a time of contrasts, if you will, in the U.S. prison system. At one extreme were those who advocated reform, such as, the Mutual Welfare League, led by a person by the name of Thomas Mott Osborne. And prison reform groups posted better treatment for inmates, an end to harsh corporal punishment, the creation of meaningful prison industries, and educational programs. And, in time, some of the more rigid prison rules gave way to the liberal reform. And by about the mid-1930s, few prisons required inmates to wear the, red and white striped convict suit that you probably saw on television, right? Nondescript gray uniforms were substituted. The code of silence ended, as did the lockstep shuffle, meaning that everybody had to walk kind of like together, right, with shackles on their legs, etc. Prisoners were allowed the freedom of the yard to basically kind of walk around and exercise an hour or two each day. Movies and radio appeared in about the 1930s, and visiting policies and mail privileges were basically liberalized, meaning that these things kind of started up again, right? And a more important trend was the development of specialized prisons designed to treat particular types of offenders, right? Which is really, kind of important. In California, San Quentin housed inmates whom correctional authorities considered, salvageable, and Folsom was reserved for those hardcore offenders. So you could see some differences there. But again, no more stripes, the code of silence left, no more, marching, the lockstep shuffle as they call it. You got movies and radio, and there were visiting times and mail. Specialized prison, meaning they put the hardcore individuals in a certain place, and even prison industries where you could do some work. And, these evolved, these prison industries. So these are all good things that started to come about. Okay. So again, prisons in the 20th century. I always throw in some different pictures of prisons. And if you don't know this one, this is Alcatraz, one of the more famous prisons. And I was actually there when they were filming The Rock with Sean Connery. My wife and I were there vacationing, and we got to watch him do some filming there, and that was actually pretty cool. And a couple of other prisons. This is Rikers Island in New York. All right, and then I wanted to show some other pictures of some correctional institutions where you can see some differences, because we've seen some changes in some prisons to where things are almost like little dorms, right? So they're really not, they're not like the old prisons that we're kind of used to. All right, you don't see a lot of these different types, but there are some as compared to what you're probably used to seeing right here, where you've got, the 2 beds and the toilet right here. Same thing here, you have a table, okay? This is solitary kind of here, and you can see the tier system, versus here, these almost look like little studios or college dormitories almost. So there's different thought processes behind these. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about parole. So while the prison is an American invention, if you will, parole was a concept that developed overseas and subsequently came to the United States. Now, the term parole itself comes from the French word promise, referring to the practice of releasing captured enemy soldiers if they promised not to fight anymore, with the threat if they did, they would be killed, then they would actually be released. So if they were recaptured, then they would basically be killed. So that's kind of where parole came from a little bit. A little bit more, that concept of parole basically spread to the United States as and as early as 1822, volunteers from the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, and I know that's kind of a big sentence there, began to help offenders once they were released from prison. In 1851, the society appointed 2 agents to work with inmates discharged from Pennsylvania penal institutions, and Massachusetts then appointed an agent in 1845 to help released inmates obtain things like jobs, clothing, and transportation. So you can see things are starting to evolve a little bit. Now, in the 1870s, using a carefully weighted screening procedure, that same individual, Zebulon Brockway, selected rehabilitated offenders from the Elmira Reformatory for early release under the supervision of citizen volunteers known as guardians. And the guardians met with these parolees at least once a month and submitted written reports on their progress. The parole concept then, of course, spread extremely rapidly after that, right? And it kind of makes sense that it did. Ohio created the first parole agency in 1884, and by 1901, as many as 20 states had created some type of parole agency. And by 1927, only 3 states, Florida, Mississippi, and Virginia, had not established some sort of parole release. Parole had basically become institutionalized, if you will, as the primary method of release from or for prison inmates, and half of all inmates released in the United States were basically paroled. So interesting how this kind of started to come about. And I threw in a couple of charts that you can even go to these websites. So this is a website called Statista. It's got a lot of good data, and this shows you individuals on parole. You can see right through here. Same with probation. So you can kind of look at the differences there. All right. So, and if you want to look at any other type of data, like I said, I'll click on this really quick so you can at least see if hopefully the link will go through while I'm on this lecture. And you can type in a keyword and it will tell you if it can give it to you. Typically it's free. Some of it you have to pay for, but you can even look like violent crime in the United States. So if you clicked on that, okay, so this one they're going to make you pay for. Let me see if we have anything. Here we go. Number of reported violent crimes. So it gives you different statistics, and it's actually really good, and it'll give you more reading about the subject down here. All right, so let's jump back to our screen here where we are at. Okay, here we go. All right, so what about contemporary correctional institutions? So the modern era has basically been a period of change and turmoil in the nation's correctional system. 3 trends kind of stand out. First, between 1960 and just about 1980 came the prisoner rights movement. And after many years of indifference, the so-called hands-off doctrine, state and federal courts ruled in case after case that institutionalized inmates had rights to freedom of religion and speech, medical care, procedural due process, and proper living conditions, right? And that kind of, makes sense. Inmates won rights unheard of in the 19th and the early 20th centuries. Since 1980, however, an increasingly conservative judiciary has curtailed the growth of inmate rights. Second, violence within the correctional system became a national concern. Well-publicized riots at New York's Attica prison and the New Mexico State Penitentiary drew attention to the potential for death and destruction that really lurks inside of every prison. And then finally, third, the view that traditional correctional rehabilitation efforts have failed has prompted many penologists, those that study penal institutions, corrections, etc., to reconsider the purpose of incarcerating criminals. Between 1960 and 1980, it was common for correctional administrators to cling to what they called the medical model, which viewed inmates as basically sick people who were suffering from some social order that prevented them from adjusting to society. It was assumed that correctional treatment would help cure them and enable them to live a productive life once they returned to the community or to society. But remember, when you're in a penal institution for a long time, do you think that you're going to come back corrected? And there's a lot of people on the other side of the coin that says, hey, you're hanging around with criminals, so how are you going to be less criminal when you come out unless they change what they've been doing? So what then about populations? Okay, and I think we'll take a look at populations and then we'll probably take our first break. So the nation's 3,200 jails are institutional facilities with basically 5 primary purposes. First, to detain accused offenders who cannot make bail. Second, to hold convicted offenders awaiting sentencing. Third, confinement for misdemeanor offenders, and as we've learned, some felonies, but we'll go by the textbook and say misdemeanors. 4, probation and parole violations. And then 5th, and finally, to house felons when state prisons are overcrowded, kind of like I said. There are sometimes felony suspects in there. Now, in addition to county jails, about 15,000 local jurisdictions maintain what they call short-term police or basically municipal lockups, okay, that house offenders for no more than 48 hours before a bail hearing can be held. And therefore, after, detainees are kept in the county jail. In some jurisdictions like Massachusetts, a house of corrections holds convicted misdemeanor suspects and a county jail holds pretrial detainees. So it's a little bit different depending upon, what jurisdiction you're in. So the jail incarceration rate is about 234 jail inmates per 100,000 U.S. residents. And about 745,000 jail inmates are behind bars at any one time. Now, today, about 9 out of every 10 inmates are adult males. And although white males make up more than 47% of all the jail population, minority overrepresentation is still a significant problem. African Americans represent over 35% and Hispanics an additional 15% of all inmates. Minority overrepresentation in the jail inmate population has remained stable over the past decade, but we do see that that's definitely a problem. Now, kind of interesting, about 14% of jail inmates are women. However, even though men make up 86% of the jail population during the past 2 decades, the percentage of adult females in jail has increased at a faster pace than basically that of males. So there are some challenges to kind of consider as it relates to females. And then I also put in here a link to the Prison Policy Initiative. And that's where this little chart comes from that gives you kind of the breakdown, if you will, of the prison population. And we're talking, this is 2020, and you can click on this link and hopefully it'll take me there, where it'll show you different reports. You can sign up for things too, but you can go down here and again, you can look at convictions, non-convictions, incarceration rates. There's all kinds of really, really good data here. So I would recommend that if you're interested, that you would take a peek at that. And I threw in a couple of slides also from, again, that other website, Statista, which is actually a really good website that talks about the number of persons in the U.S. in jail by gender. So you can see male versus female. All right. So let's finish up with jail conditions and we'll take our first break. So jails are usually a low priority item in the criminal justice system because they are often administered on a county level. Jail services have not been sufficiently regulated, nor has a unified national policy been developed to mandate what constitutes, an adequate jail condition, if you will. Consequently, jails in some counties, not all, but in some, are physically deteriorated, holding dangerous and troubled individuals, many of whom who suffer from emotional problems and remain untreated. So a lot of, things. Many jail inmates are sexual abuse survivors. And again, many suffer from mental illness. Many of the inmates have been victims of prior physical and sexual abuse. More than 10% of male inmates and nearly 50% of female inmates. And about 2/3 of all jail inmates report having a mental health problem, including more than 15% who basically display psychotic symptoms. And, jails are typically kind of referred to as a revolving door of the justice system, right? Millions of people enter jails each year and millions are released only to be rearrested and incarcerated again soon after returning to their communities. So there's a lot of issues that we have to consider as it relates to recidivism, which is a term for being imprisoned or incarcerated, coming out, reoffending, coming out, reoffending, etc. Okay, so this would be a great time to take a break. We're right about the 42, 43 minute mark, so this will conclude part 1 of chapter 13.